Hi theory students. Today we will finish talking about the chapter on modulation. We're going to cover pivots to other closely related keys. In the last video cast we covered the pivots going from a major key to its dominant or a minor key to its relative major. We'll look at other possibilities here. We'll also look at direct modulations in which we don't use a pivot chord. And we'll talk about some tips in how to harmonize modulating melodies. First, other pivot chord modulations. The most common is going from a major key to the submediant. Think of that as the relative minor. They share the same key signature, so there are many pivot choices. A 2 chord in the major key is a 4 chord in the minor. A 4 chord in the major key is a 6 chord in the minor. And those are all good choices since they use the predominant in each key. Here's an example. Imagine in F major that we establish the key. And then go on from here to go to the relative minor D. We did that by going to the G minor chord. That's a 2 chord in F, a 4 chord in D, and then a cadential 6/4 in D, which brings about the modulation to the relative minor. The other common possibility is in a minor key going to the key of the dominant minor. For example, if we're in D minor, we could go to the key of A minor. Here, while there are many possibilities for pivot chords, the best one is when a 1 chord in your original key is reinterpreted as a 4 chord in the dominant minor. The other possibilities, for example, 3 chord is a 6 chord, or the 7 chord is the 3 chord. These don't work as well because these chords in each of the minor keys seems to hint at the relative major and doesn't pull so strongly to the new key. If you want to see a good example of the modulation to the dominant minor, look in the book at example 22.6, in which the Corelli piece goes from D minor to the key of A minor. In this particular example, where we have a Phrygian half cadence in the key of D, what happens after that, the next phrase begins with a 1, and then we have a secondary dominant to the minor dominant, and here is our pivot chord. Then the D minor chord that we get over here is reinterpreted as a 4 in A minor. After the cadence here, you might be tempted to call that the pivot, especially since we get an E major chord going to an A minor in first inversion. But I think because of the strong half cadence here going to a 1, we tend to hear that as a resolution of the 5 rather than something that can have a dual interpretation. Look over that example and listen to it in the book and you'll get the idea. Modulation to the other closely related keys are possible with pivot chords, but each one is problematic in a way. If we're going to the supertonic, or in other words, the key of scale degree 2 in our major key. Most of the pivots involve one chord or another that won't work as well either in the original major key or in the new minor key. So what happens then is that most of the time, if we're going, let's say, from D major to E minor, then we will probably do something that involves a secondary dominant, a 5/7 of 2, we'll tonicize E, and then we will have subsequently a more conclusive cadence in the key of E to confirm the new key. But then that doesn't really use a pivot, since the secondary dominant isn't a chord in the key of D. For the other keys, the key of the median, or 3, is less common. It's just 3 in a major key, as you know, is not emphasized very much. And 5 of 3 would involve 2 alterations to the major key, not just 1. The key of the subdominant is also problematic because 5 of the subdominant is our tonic chord, right? So 1 equals 5 of 4. And the problem is it's very hard for us not to hear 1 as being the tonic. So therefore we sometimes can do it using a pivot chord, such as a 2 chord in the new key, in the old key rather, equals a 6 chord in the new key. I'll show you an example of this. Here we hear a progression establishing G major. And then I'll go on and use the 2 chord as a pivot as a 6 in C major as well. If that didn't sound like the most graceful kind of modulation, it's because, as I said, going from G major to C major, the subdominant, isn't as likely or as strong a movement. It's just as likely that we would use a 5/7 of 4 to go to 4 and then have a cadence establishing that later. The next concept is one of direct modulations. Here there is no pivot, and sometimes these are called abrupt modulations or phrase modulations because they occur most often at the start of a phrase after a cadence in the old key. Sometimes they occur in the middle of the phrase, but usually they're in a place where the old key is very well established, and then all of a sudden we begin in the new key, and it sounds abrupt. I'll show you an example of a phrase modulation from a Bach chorale. This example is in your book as well. So here we have a cadence in F, and then we begin immediately in D minor. It's abrupt here because we end this phrase in F and begin immediately with a chord that's not in F major, the A major chord in first inversion, which is, of course, is a dominant chord in D minor, and the rest of this phrase confirms the modulation to D minor. As was the case in the example I just showed you, When we have an abrupt modulation, we can sometimes start with a new tonic chord, but the new tonic chord, remember, is a chord in our original key, and it's hard to hear the key changing immediately with a chord that is in both the old key and the new key. But even better, if we start with a dominant or a leading tone chord in the new key, we'll immediately get the feeling that we've left the old key. The last concept we'll be covering today is harmonizing modulating melodies. And here's what we suggest. You need to write a progression that establishes the first key, and this can be done with a cadence at the end of a phrase or with a strong progression earlier in the phrase. Look to the end of the next phrase for a cadential pattern in the new key, and then choose a pivot chord right before the dominant of where the new key starts to appear. Let me show you an example from a Schubert melody that's used in the book as example 22.11. Here, the melody in E minor. A cadence, and clearly a half cadence in E. The melody goes from here and it's easy to imagine a G major cadence there. So let's work backwards. Let's look at the cadence here. This looks like a cadential 6/4 resolving there, and an appoggiatura going to the tonic there. So a cadence might be like that. So then let's go right before that and imagine how we're going to get into that dominant chord. One way to do it is from a 4/6 in the key of E minor that works as a 2/6 in the key of G. Again, a good choice for a pivot would be a predominant chord that's going to lead to a dominant in the new key. So after the half cadence, one can imagine the one chord resolving the E minor at the beginning of the next phrase, 4/6, 5, through the suspension back to the 4/6, and then a very nice cadence in G. It's hard to give exact rules about harmonizing melodies as usual, but the tips about looking forward to the cadence, making a good cadence in the new key, and then working backwards to where one can find a pivot will usually work well. That's all for today.